Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Good. So that's me, Simon Mills. I have several roles, and I've put a few links up there to represent. You can always follow them through. I have been a practitioner now for 44 years, mostly in, almost always in Exeter. I have been in the premises you see here for the last 15 years, and before that in the centre of Exeter. So Exeter is in the southwest of England. It's an ancient city, originally set up by the Romans, and there's a lot of ancient, and I'm working in a very old building here. This is the room I'm in is 700 years old. So we have tradition behind us, and I will be speaking about traditional medicine and specifically how to bring them safely into a modern world. I appreciate many of you are already practitioners, some of you are not, so I'm going to assume little expertise in herbs, and forgive me for those who know all this very well. I still hope that some of this will be useful, interesting, and I shall look forward to your comments. We'll run this in 3 sections, so we'll have a break in about an hour, and then another break an hour later, and then in the last hour we will have, I shall focus on traditional medicine and traditional approaches to safe use, and then we'll have a question and answer session. So, can you hear me all well? Is that so far? Good. I shall press on. This is, we're talking specifically about, and just to remind you that the word prudent is an English word. I apologize for speaking only in English today. Prudent is careful in English. So we're looking at how we can carefully use herbs, use them safely. And a lot of this comes from a book that I co-wrote with Kerry Bone. It's already 15 years old. However, a lot of that material is still current, and we've updated it as we go along, but that book is still available for those who want to have a reference text. So what we'll cover today, several topics around the issue of safety. The first is the quality issues, and we'll look at different types of adverse reactions to herbs. We'll look at herb-drug interactions specifically. We'll take a few guidelines for the prudent practitioner, take a brief look at false news. This is something that we are troubled by a lot in the herbal world. And then, as I said, in the last hour, we'll look at traditional indications and contraindications. So quality, let's start with that. This is our first threat. And if we look at safety issues in relation to herbs and look at reports of safety problems that are reported in, then quality control is by far the most important risk that we have. And in the herbal world, all is not what it seems. So you pick up something as a supplement or a product that you buy, maybe online even, and it says something on the label. The problem is that in an unregulated market, as most of us work in, certainly in the UK and in the USA, which I know very well, there are little regulations for what we call food supplements in those, or dietary supplements in those markets, and poor quality and adulterations are very widespread. And this is already a 20-year-old comment, but it's not far wrong that 75% of herbal products in the United States are of poor quality. And that is a real setback to everything we want to do. And history tells us this is not a new problem, but human beings are human beings, and there's no alternative but you have to regulate our tendencies to get away with things. So we can go back 3,500 years and see that there have been abuses and penalties right from the early stages of providing medicines, so that in ancient Egypt, it's reported that if the rules of medicine were followed and the patient died, physicians were absolved. However, if they broke the written rules and the patient died, they themselves received the death penalty. So that was a fairly strict regulation. I don't think we need to see that happening. In ancient Rome, we have this comment from Pliny that physicians rely upon druggists' shops which spoil everything with fraudulent adulterations. And for a long time, they've been buying plasters and eye salves ready-made, and thus has deteriorated rubbish of commodities and the fraud of the druggist trade put on show. So that's 2,000 years old. Clearly, they had their problems as well. And 700 years ago, we have in Damascus a comment that it is necessary that Mu'tazib make them fearful, try them and warn them against imprisonment. He must caution them with punishment. Their syrups and drugs may be inspected at any time without warning after their shops are closed for the night. That's a very interesting comment, that last one, because the way in which medicines are regulated and which allows them largely to be reliable, so that when we buy a bottle of aspirin, 75 milligrams on the label, when you analyze it, you will find somewhere between 73 and 77 milligrams in each of those tablets, because the manufacturer can always be inspected at any time without warning necessarily, and make sure that their processes are properly in place. And that makes the difference between a medicines or pharmaceutical manufacturer and many of the supplement manufacturers who don't have that external inspection. A more modern 1841 in our calendar comment says 150 years ago, 170 years ago, the founder of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain noted that in reviewing the history of pharmacy in all ages, we find that fraud has always prevailed to a remarkable extent. So this is a wake-up call that, you know, we need to have some external oversight of the manufacture of our products, simply because people do tend to get away with it. And a very good example of that in herbs. And by the way, the word drug in English comes from an old European word, drogen, which means dried plant. So the original drugs are originally dried plants, dried herbs, as we understand. The problem with drying a herb is that as you dry them, you lose weight. So there is a temptation on the part of the supplier who's selling by weight not to dry absolutely brittle hard, but to leave just a little bit of water in the mix. So even 1% of water can add significantly to the weight of the dried herb. The problem with that, of course, is that makes the herb more liable to get infection, mold or other contamination, simply because it's not absolutely dry. And that's a word in English that used to be called wetting, and one of the oldest problems that apply to the supply of herbs, the need to get them absolutely dry to make them safe. So this is a cartoon which says herbal cure not to be taken seriously. Wasn't really meant to be very kind to herbs. So it's something that we do need to take account of. So here are a few examples. Valerian, a very common herb, widely adulterated around the world, because there are various other species of valerian, not all of which have been studied at all, and some which have been studied have been found to be quite different in their effects or less effective than the Valeriana officinalis that we hope. And some valerian root in the market can be adulterated with a poisonous plant called Veratrum album. So one classic example of a very common herb that is not always what it seems to be on the label. Ginkgo is a very good example here. It's originally from Asia and China, grows widely as an ornamental tree. That leaf is the origin of the medicine that you often get in Europe based on ginkgo. And on the back of the research on this, it's a very strong extract, 50-to-1 extract of the leaf. So there's very little evidence for the leaf itself, but there's a lot of evidence for this very strong extract. However, on the back of this evidence, a lot of ginkgo products are on the market, and they consistently show about a third of them are not what they should be. They're often adulterated with flavonoids, additives like rutin to bump up their content. And a study in Hong Kong found that almost all of the products that they tested contained levels of ginkgolic acids which exceed the WHO, World Health Organization, recommendations multiple times. So simply showing a lack of straightforward quality control that is really quite worrying. And the main message is that you really need to be careful when you're buying ginkgo products that you've got the right source in. This is another classic example. 30% of black cohosh is a remedy often used for female problems, particularly around the menopause. 30% of all black cohosh products in the USA are not this plant, and this is consistent. This goes back over decades. It consistently comes up that about a third of black cohosh products are not black cohosh. There are a different species, and there is one, a potentially toxic Asian species that are often substituted for black cohosh because it's cheaper. And again, price is the main driver of much of this. If you're not absolutely double checking, then there's a temptation to put in cheaper substitutes for the plant that you're selling. And the classic example in black cohosh is that it was around 20 years ago, associated with liver problems, including a death and liver transplants. And in the UK, I was involved with the regulator at that time, and we were able to check the origin of 4 out of these associations between black cohosh and liver trouble. And we found that there was one product, which we then went and had a look at, and it says black cohosh on it, and it says standardized herbal extract, and has all the language on it that you would expect for a high quality product. But when we looked at it, it was in fact the Asian species I talked about earlier, the one that's actually slightly toxic. So it's a classic example that you really do need to check your source of your products to make sure that they are of quality. And there's a general advice that only buy from suppliers you trust, and particularly avoid buying on speculation on the internet, where a lot of the trouble products end up. And as fast as a supplier is discovered and closed down, you will find they come up again with another name and the same products. And there's a real problem about products that have been rejected as of poor quality coming back onto the market and being sold cheaper. So the main message is buy only from people you trust, and go as close to the source as you can when you are getting your remedies. So this is the point I made earlier, that adulterated herbs are the most common source of adverse events that are recorded in the literature. And here are a few examples. And this is the famous example that was really troubling about 25 years ago, a bit less than that. A Chinese remedy, Aristolochia, a Chinese remedy, Stephania tetandra, was replaced by another one, Aristolochia. So many of the products that were sold as Stephania tetandra were actually Aristolochia. The problem is that in Caucasians particularly, I think less so in Asians, there is a real risk with Aristolochia. And this came to a head particularly in this 1994 paper, which reported on 70 cases of kidney damage relating to the consumption in a slimming regime of Stephania tetandra and Magnolia officinalis. 30 of these cases had terminal kidney failure. And it was found that the Stephania tetandra, which Mandarin name is Hang Feng Ji, had been replaced by Aristolochia Feng Ji, containing aristolochic acid. And this was found and clearly identified as the source of these very dangerous cases. It was, just to complicate matters, there was a lot of other drugs being provided in these regimes. It was one particular clinic, in fact, that was providing these products. And there was some concern that it may be an interaction between Aristolochia and some of the diuretic medicines that were being prescribed at the same time. This was a conventional slimming clinic. So it wasn't clearly straightforward, but it led to a major shift in the overview of herbal remedies in the UK particularly, and also in Europe. And a lot of new measures were put in place to prevent this happening. Unfortunately, it was found as a result of this that it was really difficult to quality assure much of the material coming from China at the time. And even in Beijing, they realized that they had to take measures to tighten up this. Unfortunately, Stephania is still being sold. That is Aristolochia, and you can still find that being supplied openly on the market. So this problem has not gone away, and it's just a reminder that we need to be careful. Here's another example. This happened about 30 years ago. I think there's a major problem with skullcap, which is the one herb on the right, a American-derived remedy used for calming and relaxing and helping with anxiety, looks in nature quite like germander, a related plant, as you see there. And germander is a lot cheaper, and during the 1980s and early 1990s, a lot of skullcap products were found on analysis to be germander, and the problem followed that in France, a retrospective study in liver units in hospitals revealed 7 patients who developed a type of liver problem after germander administration, and the symptoms disappeared after they stopped germander and reappeared on re-administration in 3 cases. Now that's a pretty clear indication that germander was the cause of it. And this is a plant, Teucrium camidris, which has been shown later to have that there are reasons why that plant could cause liver damage, but the point being there that people thought that they were taking skullcap, and this is again caused people to tighten up on some of the process involved in safe quality. And so a few examples. Belladonna is a relatively toxic herb, deadly nightshade, as it's sometimes called in English. Burdock is a common, very safe herb, but with leaves that look a little like belladonna when they're dried. And several cases have been reported that when people were buying burdock, they were actually consuming belladonna. That's clearly a serious problem. In many Asian traditional remedies, particularly from India, the Ayurvedic remedies, you find that adding heavy metals is part of an old traditional approach to getting a more whack in your medicines. And this comes from a time, of course, before modern pharmaceutical medicine, and a time when you needed desperate measures sometimes to save lives. So they would traditionally add heavy metals into medicines on purpose in order to make their medicines stronger. And that still comes through in modern products. And so again, we have found heavy metal adulteration quite serious levels in some Ayurvedic remedies. And again, in India, they've had to tighten up some of these controls to reduce that risk. And the similar thing found in some Chinese skin creams that simply to improve their efficacy, manufacturers found sometimes no reason why they shouldn't bump them up with a little bit of steroids in the creams. And again, these have been found as an adulteration. So again, more reasons to double check the quality of some of these products. Right, so those are concerns in relation to quality control. I now want to look at, and I'm getting all the bad news out of the way first. So we're looking at all the risks and the problems associated with herbs, and we'll come back to how we balance all this out. So, but the next bit of bad news, shall we say, that we need to take account of is that not all plants are safe. And we know that there are poisonous plants, and the point being that they sometimes find their way into herbal medicine as well. So we should at least recognize what these types of plants are. So we'll go through a few just so that we're clear what we're talking about here. So some plants are poisons, as we said. So there's a bunch of plants with anticholinergic and other synapse blocking constituents called alkaloids. And a good example is, I mentioned deadly nightshade a little while back as an adulteration of burdock. Well, here's a gentler version of deadly nightshade. It's called bittersweet or woody nightshade. It's a common plant in Europe, and it, as its name suggests, it has both a bitter and a sweet taste. And it's what we call an anticholinergic herb. In other words, it blocks sympathetic activity, parasympathetic activity. So it's often used to, for example, to open up airways in asthmatic conditions, and many of these remedies were actually smoked, like tobacco, in asthma to quickly open up the airways. And there's a number of plants of this genus that were used for that purpose. But in anything other than a very low dose, these are and should be seen as poisons. So one of the plants to be avoided unless you really, really know what you're doing and can get your dose exactly right. And they're controlled in most jurisdictions as well. Don't need much introduction to this, but this is one of the most effective traditional plants in the world. Opium, the source of morphine, of course, and then the heroin, the drug of abuse. Opium in its original form was one of the great medicines of history, as a pain reliever, as a way of reducing extreme symptoms in many serious illnesses, and highly valued, of course, for that purpose. The slight complication, as we know, is that it also gives you a mental and psychological experience that people spend a lot of money trying to achieve, and heroin addiction, of course, is a serious problem in many parts of the world. The use of opium poppy as a medicine and at its safest is simply making teas out of those seed heads there, and for that you can get quite a useful sedative effect, but it's almost always controlled as a medicine, illegal in most jurisdictions. And just a reminder that some of these old remedies are very strong and, of course, are chosen. And many of these quite strong acting herbs were the basis of modern medicines. And this is obviously one example with morphine. This is a cactus in Central America, southern USA, the mescaline cactus, used a lot by shamans as a guide to their spirit journeys, because when you ingest this cactus, you get hallucinations. And it's just a reminder again, and again, you don't need very much to get those effects. It's just a reminder how powerful plants can be, and they work directly in these cases on the synapses in the central nervous system. So something to be treated with enormous care. And again, with hallucinogens like this, and of course we can also add cannabis and other hallucinogenic plants to this list. They're not on our materia medica in practice, and we just note them as of interest as plants that have a very powerful. So that's one group. Looking now at types of glycosides you find in plants. So there's two here: cyanogenic glycosides and cardiac glycosides. And I'll give a couple of examples. This is a cardiac glycoside called foxglove. And you may recognize it, if you don't know the English name, you may recognize it from its botanical name, digitalis, because this, of course, is the origin of one of the most powerful and most widely used heart drugs in the world, digoxin. And this powerful effect, I mean, it's an interesting story because it comes from an observation that a physician in England made in 1700s in dealing with a very serious problem at that time, which was called dropsy. Dropsy was a condition in which your limbs, your lower limbs, your legs, swelled with water. And there are drawings of the time of people with gross leg deformities, simply with massive edema, congestion in the legs. And the standard way that physicians used to deal with this, as you would expect, was to give diuretics, remedies that would help the body to get rid of water. However, these are very limited effect. And William Witheridge, a physician at the time, noted that there were some of his patients who had gone to a herbalist, a woman, and had reported dramatic benefits for dropsy. So unlike most of his colleagues who rejected old herbal traditions, he went and had a closer look and found that this woman was giving a poison called digitalis to the putting it in her mix. And he was interested enough to go and have a closer look at this and found that it contained this glycoside, which didn't work as a diuretic at all, but worked as a heart drug. And that observation transformed the treatment of dropsy, which we now call, of course, heart failure. And that diagnosis came directly out of observing the effect of this plant. Digitalis is a classic arrow poison from the old days. It was actually used in hunting to poison the tips of arrowheads. And it's just an example of how a poison can, at a low dose, find its way into medicine. Old herbalists did use the leaf of foxglove, digitalis, for heart failure. However, it's quite a powerful remedy, and so we don't tend to use that type of plant at all in modern times. But there is another one called lily of the valley, or convallaria, that is gentler in its effect. A good example, as I said, of a quite poisonous plant that can be used for medicinal purposes. This is a cyanogenic glycoside now. This is the hawthorn or mayflower, the name given to the first pilgrim boats that went across from England to the North America, was the mayflower. So we sometimes see it as a sort of connection between the two continents. This is in flower now in this country. It's just started to flower. There's a lot of it about. It's got these classic looking leaves you can see there. and it happens to be one of my favorite remedies. It's a heart remedy and a circulation remedy. So it's a great support for a heart that's slightly under power, for circulation that's poor. So you get poor peripheral, as we say, circulation, so that the small blood vessels are perhaps sclerosed or in other ways not working so well. Hawthorn is a classic heart and circulation remedy. And when its benefits, which have been established now in clinical research for some time, I know for a fact, because at least 2 pharmaceutical companies contacted me many years ago to ask them to help me to help them to come up with the active principle of Hawthorn. They were hoping for another heart drug like foxglove. Instead, we found it was a combination of things. And that's important because one of the things are cyanogenic glycosides. And these are, as the name suggests, cyanide-producing glycosides, so that they produce cyanide when you hydrolyze them. And cyanide is a famous poison, of course. So what is this familiar, very safe remedy doing with cyanide in it? Well, it shares that, of course, with all members of its family, which include almonds, peaches, plums, the stone fruits, the rose family generally, all have these cyanide producing constituents. The point being is that they generate cyanide at very, very low levels, so that the effect in Hawthorn is to calm the heart, to reduce it when it is overactive, when it is stimulated, when it is maybe in anxiety or whatever. It will calm the heart and steady it. And Hawthorn then contains a lot of flavonoids and polyphenols that open up the circulation at the same time. So it's a combination of effects. You have flavonoids and polyphenols opening up the circulation, and the cyanide producing glycosides calming the heart. And it's that magic combination which gives Hawthorn its benefits. And you can't extract a single chemical drug out of it. And so in both cases I know of, the pharmaceutical companies walked away because they realized they couldn't mimic these effects. So an example, in fact, of a potentially poisonous constituent actually having a very substantial beneficial effect. The main sort of dramatic effect of cyanide constituents is in cough mixtures. So relative of Hawthorn is the wild cherry, and the bark of that is often used as a cough medicine. And that the cyanide levels are high enough to suppress the cough reflex. But that's probably as far up the chain as you go. Some of you may remember there was a time when cancer treatments, natural cancer treatments, included apricot kernels, the seeds, the core seeds of apricots, and they included an ingredient which was a cyanogenic glycoside called amygdalin, and at that, the levels that they were taking, they were actually cytotoxic. So the cyanide was actually getting close to being a poison at the levels that they were being taken. So it was slightly amusing for some of us to see that a so-called natural approach to cancer treatment included a near poisonous dosing with a plant, apricot kernels. Next group of plant poisons are those that are toxic to the liver, to the kidney, and to the nervous system. And I've just bunched a few things in together there. So these are plants that have been associated with potential harm to these organs or these tissues. And the classic example in European and North American traditions is comfrey, symphytum. There's several species there. And that is an enormously powerful remedy for wound healing. So the leaf or the root of this plant, if you mulch it up into a pack or a poultice and apply it to an open wound, will actually seal up the wound and help to heal it. And it's not just superficial wounds that it has this effect, because one of its common English names is knit bone. And I remember many years ago noticing that there's an area in England, Eastern England, where they have race horse stud farms where they breed race horses and race them. And I noted that a few of them had patches of comfrey growing near the stables. And it wasn't because the stable owners were romantics or believed in herbal medicine. It was because they knew that if they packed a damaged a fetlock or a horse that had sprained or broken a bone in its legs, and they packed it with comfrey as a poultice, that the bone would heal faster. And there is a good plausible mechanism for this. We haven't got time to go into for now, but I've seen personally dramatic healing happening with this plant. The problem is that it contains a type of alkaloid called pyrazidine alkaloids, which have been shown to be liver toxic, hepatotoxic. And even 35 years ago, it was agreed in the UK that comfrey should not be sold for internal use, because many people traditionally have used it for healing the lining of the gut, you know, for if you have ulcers or inflammation in the stomach or in the bowel, they would often take comfrey. It's got a lot of very healing mucilaginous properties. However, in that form, it was thought, and it's still thought, that it generates enough of these liver toxic levels to be a risk. So for most of the last 3 decades or so, we have not used comfrey internally. However, I still use comfrey externally without a problem. There's no limitations to that. Although on open wounds, it is probably best now no longer to use it, at least for any length of time, because the alkaloids get absorbed into the open wounds. But as a poultice over a damaged or broken bone, if you're recovering from a broken bone, and you can put comfrey as a cream or as a poultice near the bone, it really does appear to accelerate bone repair and other tissue repair under the skin. So it's an example of a plant that in theory or in practice probably has liver toxic effects, still has a very important use in medicine. I couldn't get away without mentioning our favorite drink, Cafe Arabica. Got caffeine in it, and caffeine is a neurotoxin. The point is, of course, that very few of us will ever consume enough of it to cause any nerve damage. Some stupid people do have so much coffee that it does upset the brain, but mostly this is used as a mild stimulant rather than as anything that's going to be toxic. And there's a principle here, and we've already seen it in the case of hawthorn. It's called hormesis, that a little bit of something that's damaging can actually be useful. And this is a classic example of hormesis, that you use something that is dangerous in quantity to be a very useful remedy in moderation. There's many other examples. I'm not going to go through a catalogue here. Just pick up on a few others. Agents that are photosensitive, photosensitizing. These are ones that make you more susceptible to ultraviolet light. And the classic example is St. John's wort, which if you took that in quantity, hypericum, you will become more susceptible to the effects of ultraviolet light. That could, of course, be a positive if you're having a serious skin problem, for example, and you needed ultraviolet treatment. A little bit of St. John's wort could encourage the benefits of ultraviolet, but generally it's seen as a negative. You shouldn't take much St. John's wort if you are susceptible to sunlight, if you have been exposed to problems of sunlight, like skin cancers and so on. Those are things where we would suggest you be careful with St. John's wort if you were ever exposed to outdoor sunlight. We've mentioned heavy metal adulteration already. These are definitely types of adverse reactions to herbs, and it's not just adding it to herbs willfully to make a strong formulation, but you can get heavy metal adulteration from herbs that are grown in old industrial sites. So cadmium and arsenic particularly are heavy metal adulterants that you can get from badly sourced plants. And again, this is where you would look for quality control in reliable suppliers who routinely should be checking for heavy metal content in the plants that they provide. Fungal or bacterial contamination, unfortunately, that is widespread, and we find that right across the sector. So, for example, many kitchen spices have been shown to have contamination, let alone the herbs that we use in medicine. One of the main risks, as I've already mentioned, is wetting, where because the herb has not been sufficiently dried, it gets mold on it in storage, and that can be quite a risk with aflatoxins. So again, these are things that your supplier should be checking for before any herb is put on the market. However, it is a very real risk when you're dealing with dried plant materials, and that includes seeds and such things that you get in the spice cabinet. So again, another reason to have good suppliers. The last thing I would like to talk before we have a break is, or maybe two things actually. I'll get in. No, we'll stick with this for the moment. Idiosyncratic reactions. These are reactions that you can't predict. This is a very big topic, and would take another hour just to talk about it. But briefly, what we usually see in terms of adverse reactions to herbs that are reported in the literature are idiosyncratic, most of them. In other words, they don't happen to everybody who takes them. They happen to a few people who are, for one reason or other, are susceptible to this. And there are many examples, but the one I just want to talk about, which was a major problem, again, about 20 years ago now, was kava, which comes from the Pacific. And this is a fabulous remedy for calming, for reducing anxiety, widely used as a recreational herb in the Pacific. So many Pacific islands, when you go and visit a family or you go and visit a community, they will share a kava drink with you as part of the evening's entertainment. And in that level, it's a calming, makes you feel happier and more, you tell better jokes. And generally it works as a social lubricant. It then became adapted as a treatment for anxiety, particularly in Europe. And for various extracts were made of the root of the plant, highlighting some of its more active constituents and extracting them out and making them stronger. And then, unfortunately, there was a slew of cases in the late 1990s where in taking kava was shown to be associated with liver disease, and there were a couple of deaths and some liver transplants associated with kava consumption as a supplement or as a medicine, particularly in Europe. And this led to a widespread banning of kava, just to cut the story short. And kava still remains banned in most European countries as a result. I was involved. In fact, if you look at the safety book that I opened with, there's a whole chapter there about the kava story, in which an expert, Helmut Schmidt, Matthias Schmidt, reviews all the cases of kava and does a very deep analysis of it, and essentially concludes that kava itself is not a problem. It is when you extract out and concentrate its actives that you get more of a risk. And furthermore, that the risk was not universal, but that there were certain individuals who had idiosyncratic reactions to the kava, dangerously so. And the problem therein was that it was impossible to predict who these people would be. And so it was concluded that it was safer to ban the whole herb itself. This has come back under review, and there's a hope that the original kava plant will be allowed back in some parts of Europe. It's still available in the USA and in one or two other places in Pacific, and Pacific countries still have it. And we hope that it will come back. But it's an example of what we call an idiosyncratic reaction that we can't duck it. There's some of the early examples I mentioned. The case of germander poisoning was almost certainly idiosyncratic. It's not a persistent thing. It just affects some people, not others. But what it means is that there is always the possibility of a reaction to any plant that you can't predict. And that includes most of the ones that we often use. So chamomile, valerian. There's been examples in each case of significant idiosyncratic reactions to them, which could cast a cloud over the supply of all of them. But as long as those idiosyncratic reactions are very rare, usually regulators don't get too concerned. So that leads me on to the next big topic, and I'm just thinking that this might be a time to have a natural break. I'm not too sure how much you want at this stage. We could take a 10-minute break now and just get up and stretch our legs a bit, and then we can come back to herb-drug interactions and carry on the conversation there.